So Resident Evil 7 came out not that long ago, and I've had a lot of people asking me if it's any good or not. But regardless, I've had a lot of people that are stalwart, die-hard fans of the series not really showing any interest in the game one way or the other. And I'll be honest, I was one of those people before I played it. I hated the idea of a first-person Resident Evil, and I figured, just like everybody else did, that Capcom was quickly trying to capitalize on the void left by PT and the cancelled Silent Hills game. What I did not expect was that this game would manage to forge its own sort of identity, not just by being something new, but also by translating the elements that gave the series its distinctive feel in the first place, and adapting them to a new perspective, masterfully so, which was a huge surprise to me. The format of this video is going to ring a few bells for anybody that watched my remake video, and you'll see why pretty quickly. But by the way, I'm going to avoid story spoilers in this review, so while I may discuss it in the broad strokes and show lots of footage and locations from the game, I plan on breaking it up enough to keep from spoiling anything really plot integral about the game, though I am going to talk in depth about a lot of the game's mechanics. But anyways, let's just get going, shall we? Control in Resident Evil 7 really is a dark horse for why this game is great, and how I knew the designers behind the scenes understood both Resident Evil and game design to a degree that I did not foresee, honestly. The controls in this game are kind of like a secret love letter to the diehard fans. The classic Resident Evil controls are defined by their weighty and measured sort of lack of precision, where in the original incarnations of the series this was done to facilitate the game's visuals first, and the survival horror second. This time around the controls are there only to serve the horror. This is done in a few incredibly subtle ways. Now, when translating the classic controls to first person, the first challenge the designers were faced with was most likely, how do we bring the lack of precision and deliberate pacing of the original's controls into this game without it having a detrimental effect on playability and the player's perception of how the controls feel? The answer is as brilliant as it is simple, honestly. The game pulls you out from directly behind the gun sights, adding that single layer of obfuscation needed to keep the aiming from feeling like a one-to-one sort of experience. This makes it harder to intuitively line up shots, as you, the player, are not directly behind the gun, and as such, not directly behind the sights. This means you have to rely solely on the reticle. This is a brilliant solution, but it's not enough alone to make the necessary difference needed to infuse tension into the game's controls. The next decision was to make the reticle shift between two specific paradigms. At close range, you have a higher rate of fire, low accuracy, and at long range, you have a really low rate of fire and a dot reticle. This, in conjunction with enemies who have very active animations and a lot of head bob, makes for a ton of wasted ammo. The game puts you in positions where to not shoot means certain death, but to shoot means you are going to have to accept a certain amount of wastage. This is brilliant on so many levels. It facilitates both the survival and horror in the game by creating a reliable over-expenditure of ammunition in combat situations, meaning the developers can more accurately tune the amount of ammo given to the player to keep them constantly on the verge of resource starvation whilst never pushing them over the edge, and adding tension to every single combat interaction, as they all have the potential to be incredibly costly as a result. This control scheme is incredibly similar to the controls in one of my favorite flawed gems of the last few years, Zombi U. Zombi U uses the exact same aiming and reticle scheme as Resident Evil 7 does, and is just far too close to the latter in control execution to not be a direct inspiration. This is really cool to me because Zombi U is one of those games that came out to sort of mediocre to bad reviews and was forgotten virtually immediately. And it's a very flawed game, and the PC version is a pale imitation of that in and of itself, but the game made just a couple brilliant design decisions that I'm so happy to see that somebody took inspiration from, especially Resident Evil. But altogether, these controls are a really interesting example of where the designer's mindset was when translating the series' feel to first person. And just as important as these controls are, I said this in my last video, but it's the truth. Horror games are probably the genre that benefits the most from increased visual fidelity, or at the very least, from a very distinct art style. Resident Evil was known for utilizing pre-rendered backgrounds to bring increased realism to the games, but as this technique does not lend itself to first person, this same intention also had to be translated, much like the controls did, if Resident Evil 7 was to really feel like a Resident Evil game. Now, the reason that pre-rendered backgrounds don't lend themselves to first person is pretty simple. They're essentially animated pictures meant to give the illusion of depth, so when you're in first person, they stick out like a matte painting would on a movie set. Real depth and artificial depth do not mix well together. It's pretty easy to see this, even in the early Resident Evil games themselves, as all of the actual 3D models stand out from the background like a sore thumb. This is useful in the older games because it keeps you from having to do the 24/7 wall hump, but you get the idea. Real 3D and pre-rendered backgrounds don't mesh together well, so the better solution for Resident Evil 7 was instead to map images of real-life people and objects to the game. This is a technique called photogrammetry. It was used to great effect in PT well before Resident Evil 7 was even a gleam in Capcom's eye. This is a perfect translation of the classic game's visuals because it takes the realism of pre-rendered backgrounds and takes them to their more granular and most logical conclusion, which is to map real-life objects and people into the game. This draws the player into the experience more in multiple ways. One is the increased visual legibility of objects and people, and the other is the better relation and connection the player has to the game world, as it includes objects that look and feel like they could belong in the real world, because in most cases, they did. Photogrammetry is a technique that's becoming more and more commonplace, as it offers an incredible degree of fidelity and is not nearly as expensive to do as you would think. Overall, the visuals in Resident Evil 7 are incredible, and even the items, objects, and, people that are the strangest have a sort of true-to-life authenticity that helps the game really sell its premise throughout. It helps to sell the player on the feel and vision of the game, a vision heavily inspired not just by classic Resident Evil, but by a lot of other things as well. Resident Evil 7 really is an amalgamation of a lot of different influences and inspirations, and there's so many that it's easy to lose track. But discovering and noticing these references and influences was so satisfying, it was such an integral part of the experience that I don't want to ruin them for anyone else. But the truth is, if you aren't looking for them, you may very well miss a lot of them altogether. I already mentioned the influence of Zombie U on the controls for the game, but this is just one of dozens. The only reason I noticed the game was doing this and making all these references were two placed really early in the game. That jumped out at me. This game seems to take some influence from the show True Detective and definitely takes some from the Evil Dead movies, the latter of which is a lot more obvious. But there are influences from a lot of major horror touchstones of our culture, and even some from non-horror sources. These influences and references don't just span movies or TV either. They span all of popular culture across games, movies, TV shows, and books. This is something that in the future is likely to spark debate over whether these influences constitute paying homage or ripping off, and while that's a slippery slope culturally, I'll just quickly say that to my mind, it's definitely homage, as the game takes these moments and pieces and combines them into one transformative work that's truly its own thing. Not just in spite of all these influences, but because of them. Now, if this were just influenced by one or two things, if it were just an Evil Dead game with Resident Evil on the title, I'd be a lot more negative in my appraisal, because taking from one source and just cribbing wholesale from that thing, that's easy. But to take from dozens of disparate sources and combine them into one cohesive whole, that's so impressive, it would be worth applauding even if it weren't good. Luckily, it is good. And playing this game and noticing these references, influences, and moments, it reminded me a lot of Stanley Kubrick movies, specifically the way cinephiles search Kubrick's movies for the subtext he's so famous for hiding in his films. These references and influences aren't just visual, they aren't just auditory, they're mechanical, they're woven into the fabric of the game. There was a moment where I felt that a portion of the game was directly meant to reference and evoke Resident Evil 2, and just when I started to think I was crazy, I used a keypad in this area. And I had a major eureka moment. There is a case to be made, I'm sure, as to how many of these references are deliberate, how many are intentional, coincidental, or came purely from genre cliches that were just established by previous works, but I'll leave that to each individual to decide. The ultimate result is still a well-paced experience that feels both foreign and familiar at the same time. Speaking of pacing, though, the puzzles of Resident Evil are a defining feature of the series as a whole, even if they were simplified and dumbed down over time to the point where their inclusion was strictly sort of perfunctory and obligational. Resident Evil 7 sees puzzles used in a different sort of way, two separate ways. One is the standard use of puzzles to break tension, like I mentioned in my last video, but the other is a really clever and interesting way to make a nod to the quicker and more superficial puzzles of the more latter-day Resident Evil games. The way they do that is by placing simple puzzles or problems directly in the middle of a moment of active tension, like placing a key needed for a door and forcing you to try and make it past the enemy pursuing you while also unlocking the door, since pausing and going to the inventory screen no longer stops the game. This uses those simple puzzles and problems as a means to amplify the tension rather than cutting it, which keeps these overly simple puzzles from insulting the player's intelligence and keeps them from feeling like filler. They become an active part of a combat engagement. You regularly have to ask yourself, how do I deal with this enemy or make enough space for myself that I can get where I need to be to use this item without dying? It takes what is superficially a ridiculously simple problem and places it in a more complicated engagement. This subtle twist keeps even the simplest of puzzles satisfying, even when these puzzles are so simple that they can barely even be called puzzles on their own. There are also more complicated puzzles, but even the most complex of these breaks down to a simple sort of logic problem. If you use the game's examine function and some baseline level of common sense, you can move through all this game's puzzles without ever really having to think a whole lot. This would be a problem if the game's puzzles were structured exactly the same way as in the classic games, as the puzzles were integral to the classic Resident Evil's experience for pacing reasons. In Resident Evil 7, the pacing is built into the game on a moment-to-moment basis with some really smart math, rather than being placed in discrete chunks. So rather than serving as pace breaks, the puzzles in the newest Resident Evil serve purely as variation, and as color for the game's narrative. The game is packed chock full of additional care like this, and these additional details serve the... This is where the game really shines in a special sort of way. The game has a really unsettling sort of surrealist tone that acts as like a emotional antenna boosting the signal of this game's atmosphere. But atmosphere is a near impossible thing to quantify, and what works well in one game for creating atmosphere might not work for another. Resident Evil 7 is another exercise in this mysterious alchemy. There are a number of elements that seem like they should be incompatible on the surface, but still somehow manage to gel into a completely cohesive whole. The game's audio does not play with foreground themes nearly as much as the series' previous games, like Remake and the others, which strikes me as a really mature choice, and the correct one more importantly. The problem with more overbearing horror music is that it can actually serve to seriously diminish the tension of the player over time. When you are in the first-person perspective, the player is meant to be as close to being in the shoes of the game's character as possible. This has some unforeseen consequences. For instance, when hearing really composed horror music, especially when it's based in the foreground, this stretches and eventually breaks the player's immersion over time, as they are aware, in most cases only subconsciously, but that the music they are hearing would not be something they would hear were they actually in the shoes of the player character. This is mostly an issue with horror games, and is why many first-person horror games, Resident Evil 7 included, derive their music primarily from the combination of ambient sounds and more subtle instrumentation. This is then supplemented with the more in-your-face musical cues, but this time used in short bursts or specific moments for greater impact overall. The subtlety of the music amplifies the player's perception of an environment, in a psychological sense, helping ensure the player is picking up on the mood and tone of the game's environmental storytelling. And this game does a lot of that. Resident Evil 7 feels like it's constantly feeding you some subtle or even subliminal information about the game's villains, about the game's setting, and about aspects of the plot yet to be made clear to the player. This serves largely the same function as good editing does in movies. For instance, imagine seeing this picture that is in the first 5 minutes of the game with no background music. You perceive it as, oh, a family picture. Now imagine this same moment with the background music and noise included, and you see something more like, they used to be normal, what the hell happened to these people? This colors the player's perception of virtually everything in the game, and I was legitimately giddy with excitement as I was playing through the game, waiting for the developers to get lazy, waiting for them to relax this attention to detail, and they never did, keeping the experience anchored even as its focus shifts throughout. I've already mentioned this game having taken influence from a lot of places. I've even mentioned how Resident Evil 7 translated the controls of all the original games to a new perspective. But this game does one more thing that's truly worthy of note, and really easy to miss. The game progressively shifts its focus to pay respect to not just the earliest entries in the franchise, but the later ones as well. The gameplay shifts between puzzles, logic, horror, and combat in a way that pays direct homage and takes direct inspiration from the Resident Evil series as a whole, in a way where by the end of the game, you feel like you've played a little of all of the Resident Evil games, but in this game's engine. I'll not go into detail on the specifics of the order of this or events because I really want people to experience it for themselves, but just to back up the statement, I'll say a couple. This game has enemies you feel are constantly following you, evoking Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. It has intense combat sections involving low resources and overwhelming odds, reminiscent of Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. It even has specific references to Resident Evil Revelations in a direct reference to the trajectory of the series. I even played through the game again straight away to make sure I was not just imagining things, but I've now played through the game 3 times, and I feel like I genuinely noticed something new each time, which in a genre that traditionally has little to no replay value, that makes all the difference. It's almost equivalent to the way film people look at Kubrick movies. I keep discovering something new every time I go back to try it again. But I've chewed your ear off long enough, so I guess let's wrap this up. There's so much more to talk about with this game. There are so many more elements I'm excited to share at some point, but I think for now you get it. I mean, this game really is something special. And I didn't expect it. I didn't even know how badly I wanted it, but this is the most excited I've been to talk about a game since before I ever even made this channel. This game's not for everyone, you know, nothing is, but if you're a horror fan or a Resident Evil fan, there's a lot here for you. Even if you're just interested in good game design, there's a lot to love here, and plenty to learn from even if scary games just aren't your thing. All said and done, I can say with no hesitation at all that this is my favorite horror game since PT, and is probably in my top 5 favorite horror games of all time. It's also pretty close to tied with Remake for my favorite game in the Resident Evil series. Not because it's a higher pinnacle than Remake, but because it's such a surprising and interesting breath of fresh air that I did not expect. Now, all that said, thank you for watching, and stick around for the subscriber and fan Super Minute.
The subscriber and fan Super Minute.
Buddy Bousty. So seriously, thank you again for watching. It really means a lot to me. I know I say it every time, but it's true. So I like to make sure I take the time to do so, and especially thank you to all the people that left me positive comments on my previous video. That really meant a lot to me as well after being gone for so long. But I also wanted to say that I put together a lot of the materials for Patreon, and I'm going to be putting that up soon here in the near future. A lot of bonus material on there, so feel free to check that out. Once it does pop up, I'll be putting up an announcement when it does happen. But I also wanted to call out, since I only did so in the description last time, that I have created and run a support group specifically for gamers that are suffering from depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. And the group is meant to bring people together to support them, and also just give a sense of normalcy where you can talk to some people and do some things without feeling socially isolated by mental illness. And it's something that's really important to me. I talk to people on there, help people on there, counsel people on there, and there's always somebody online 24/7, day or night. So if you feel like that's something that you might benefit from, or that you have a problem and somebody there may be able to help you, please feel free to come on and join in. I'll post a link down in the description for the Discord group, and like I said, anybody that feels they need it is welcome. But okay, that's gonna wrap it up for me for this week, so thank you again for watching. Seriously, truly, thank you to everybody that's left positive comments. Thank you to everybody in advance who has shared my work and may share this. I'm really proud of this video. I hope it came through in the video itself, because I felt like this one was something special. So thank you in advance, and thank you for those in the past. So alright everybody, have a good one.